It's worth beginning with a simple but unfashionable proposition. Russia is not Putin and the Kremlin is not Russia. A country is more than a bunker that presumes to speak for it. That distinction is not a sentimental nicety, it's an analytic necessity with strategic consequences. Consider the men who are now fighting against Moscow's regime from the Ukrainian side. The Russian Volunteer Corps, founded by Denis Nikitin, draws its defectors from Wagner, from disillusioned soldiers, ex-FSB, and civilians like White from Samara. They have raided Belgorod and Kursk, taken prisoners and conducted sabotage inside the Russian Federation expressly to topple the regime they once served. You may dislike their politics or their methods, but you cannot deny the fact that they are Russians risking their lives to break Putin's machine. They are a human footnote that demolishes the lazy claim that Russia equals its ruler. And the distinction matters because much of Russian society is not mobilized for this war in spirit, even if it is trapped in it by fear. Long-run survey work suggests a public increasingly split, war-weary and unconvinced that the costs match the stakes. In 2024, a majority preferred a ceasefire over continued fighting, with support for a new mobilization notably soft. That's not heroic dissidence. It's the ordinary calculus of people who do not believe this is a cause worth dying for. Read that carefully. Not a cause worth dying for. Listen to that. This is precisely the crack in the facade that makes mass mobilization so perilous for Putin's regime. If society is ambivalent, why do we not see a tidal wave of protest? Because protest has been criminalized. Since March 2022, war censorship statutes have carried penalties of up to 15 years for speech that discredits the army. The names are not obscure. Maria Ponomarenko's sentence was extended for posts about Mariupol. The artist Alexandra Shotchilenko was jailed for replacing supermarket tags with anti-war labels, then freed only in a prisoner swap. There are hundreds like them. This is the architecture of silence, not consent. Even so, Russians still found frictionless forms of speech. Navalny's last appeal asked people to appear at polling stations at noon on election day. They did. Cues from Moscow to provincial cities, a quiet act that said, "We are here, we have not vanished, and your 87% is not the whole of Russia." That election, marred by coercion and remote e-voting ticks, was theatre for power, not a plebiscite of a nation. So what does it mean, then, to say Russia is also a victim of this war? Not in the false equivalence with Ukraine. The aggressor is clear. It means that the Kremlin has turned its own citizens into instruments, hostages and casualties of a policy that degrades both neighbour and homeland. The human costs are not only the dead at the front, they are the jailed journalists, the exiles, the mothers afraid of a knock at night, the students fed a steady diet of bombast in place of civic education. They are the veterans who will return to a brittle economy and a moral hangover. The distinction clarifies policy. If Russia is not reducible to the Kremlin, we must design pressure that bites the war machine while leaving the door open for the country's future. We should have been working hard to challenge the propaganda that Putin puts out across the whole of Russia. We haven't done that because we're too arrogant to think that propaganda could possibly be directed at anyone other than us. Propaganda is directed 24/7 across the whole of Russia. First, we need to strangle the logistics of aggression, not the oxygen of civil society. Britain's latest sanctions targeted the shadow fleet moving Russian oil and the companies feeding electronics and explosives into missile production. That is where economic pressure is morally clean and strategically sharp. Second, support for Ukraine's victory with material means and political patience is essential. Aid packages for energy resilience and humanitarian need are not charity, they are investments in the principle that borders are not optional. When the UK adds winter fuel support alongside sanctions, it is matching words with levers that affect the battlefield and the back office of war. Thirdly, we need to widen the lanes for Russians who refuse complicity. That includes visas for those facing persecution under speech laws, scholarships for students who will not parrot propaganda, and Russian language broadcasting that treats viewers as citizens, not targets. The goal is to keep an audience alive for a different Russian future. Fourthly, we need to be realistic about timelines and illusions. A post-Putin Russia will not magically convert to a liberal republic by osmosis. There are militant nationalists waiting to claim the betrayal myth. There are also millions who want ordinary life, schools that teach, courts that judge, and officials who do not steal. Public opinion research shows a persistent preference for domestic development over imperial posturing. Policy should speak to that. Fifthly, and lastly, we need to keep the memory of individual courage at the centre, not as hagiography, but as evidence. Vladimir Kuromutsa chose prison for telling the truth about war and paid with 25 years before a swap took him out of Russia. Navalny died in an Arctic colony after turning cues into a language of dissent. These are not the props of Western conscience. They are proof that the line between Russia and the Kremlin is drawn by Russians themselves, often at a terrible cost. A word about those fighting Putin with rifles rather than placards. Some anti-Kremlin units contain figures with extremist pedigrees themselves. We should be candid about that and refuse to launder ideologies we would denounce anywhere else. Yet, we should also grasp the underlying fact their existence reveals. The regime's claim to represent the nation is decaying. When Russians in uniform fight Russians in uniform across a border that Moscow insisted was sacred, the spell of imperial unity is broken. Now, none of this absolves Russia of responsibility. It prevents us from making a category error. If you collapse a people into a ruler, you reward the ruler's own propaganda. If you distinguish them, you see the levers that matter, the sanctionable networks, the brittle morale, the censored yet persistent people, the soldiers who sign contracts because the draft would break the country, and the activists who whisper because shouting will end their lives. It's so important to recognize that Russia is a multifaceted society. I've lived there, I know, and that Putin does not speak for the whole of Russia. The Kremlin does not speak for the whole of Russia. But simply because there are Russians who oppose Putin doesn't mean they are necessarily aligned with what one might casually call Western values. But it does mean that Putin cannot speak for the whole of the nation that he has led into this mindless and pointless war.